Tell me about a time you gave constructive feedback. Introduction. This is a common behavioral interview question for software developers, backend developers, full-stack developers, senior developers, and team leads. Interviewers ask this question to understand how you communicate feedback, how you help teammates improve, how you handle sensitive conversations, how you avoid sounding critical or personal, how you support code quality, how you give feedback during code review, how you improve the team without creating conflict. This question is especially important for, Java developers, backend developers, Spring Boot developers, full-stack developers, junior software developers, senior software developers, team leads, Agile teams. The best way to answer this question is by using the STAR method. STAR means S. Situation. Explain the background. T. Task. Explain your responsibility. A. Action. Explain what you personally did. R. Result. Explain the final outcome. A good interview answer usually spends 10% situation, 10% task, 60% action, 20% result. The most important part is the action section, because interviewers want to understand how you gave feedback respectfully and helped improve the outcome. Question: tell me about a time you gave constructive feedback. Example 1. Giving feedback during code review situation. In one sprint, a teammate submitted a pull request for a new Spring Boot REST API. The feature worked correctly, but I noticed some maintainability concerns. The API returned a database entity directly, validation logic was duplicated, and test coverage was limited. Task: my responsibility was to review the code and give feedback in a way that improved the solution without discouraging the teammate. Action: I first reviewed the pull request carefully and confirmed that the main functionality worked. Then, I gave feedback in a constructive way. Instead of saying, "This is wrong," I explained the reason behind each suggestion. I mentioned, check, returning entities directly can expose internal fields. Check, response DTOs keep the API contract stable. Check, duplicate validation logic becomes hard to maintain. Checks help protect future changes. Checks, consistent error responses help front-end integration. I also shared an existing example from the codebase that followed the recommended pattern. For the larger comments, I suggested a short call instead of leaving too many review comments. During the call, I explained the trade-offs and offered to pair on the DTO mapping and test updates. Result: the team updated the pull request successfully. The API became cleaner, safer, and easier to maintain. The teammate also used the DTO and validation pattern in future stories. Why this answer works? This answer is strong because it shows constructive code review, respectful communication, technical reasoning, API design knowledge, maintainability focus, helping teammate improve. Example 2. Giving feedback about test coverage situation. A teammate completed a feature with complex business rules. The implementation worked for the happy path, but the pull request had only one basic test. I was concerned that edge cases could break later. Task: I needed to give feedback about improving test coverage without making the teammate feel blocked unfairly. Action: I started by acknowledging that the main implementation was working. Then I explained that because the feature had several business rules, happy path testing alone was not enough. I suggested specific test cases instead of giving vague feedback. I recommended tests for valid request, missing required field, invalid status, unauthorized user, duplicate business key, downstream service failure, unexpected exception, edge case input. I also explained why each test mattered. For example, testing duplicate business keys would prevent production data issues. Testing unauthorized users would protect security behavior. I offered to help write the first few tests so the teammate could follow the pattern. Result: the teammate added the important tests. QA found fewer issues during testing. The teammate later started adding better test coverage in future pull requests without being reminded. Why this answer works? This answer is good because it shows quality mindset, specific feedback, test strategy, support instead of criticism, mentoring, long-term team improvement. Example 3. Giving feedback about communication situation. In one project, a teammate was making good technical progress, but they often gave updates late. This caused dependency issues because other developers and QA did not know when their work would be ready. Task. I wanted to give feedback respectfully so the teammate understood the impact without feeling blamed. Action. I spoke with the teammate privately instead of raising it in front of the whole team. I started by saying that I appreciated their technical work and that the feature was moving forward. Then, I explained the impact of late updates. I said that when progress or blockers were not shared early, it made it harder for others to plan integration and testing. I suggested a simple improvement. Share blockers during daily stand-up. Add short updates in the ticket. Mention dependency risks early. Ask for help sooner if stuck. Confirm expected completion before QA testing. I also asked if there was anything making updates difficult for them. They explained that they were focused on solving the issue and forgot to update the ticket. We agreed on a lightweight update process. Result: communication improved. QA and other developers had better visibility. The teammates started raising blockers earlier, and sprint coordination became smoother. Why this answer works? This answer is strong because it shows key: private feedback, empathy, focus on work impact, communication improvement, no blame, team delivery mindset. Example 4. Giving feedback about API design situation. In one project, a teammate designed an API that returned too much data to the front end. The API worked, but it exposed fields the UI did not need and created unnecessary response size. Task. I needed to give feedback on the API design and help improve it before release. Action. I first confirmed the front-end requirements. Then I compared the response fields with what the UI actually displayed. I found that several internal fields were not needed. I gave feedback that the API should return only what the client needed. I explained the benefits: smaller response size, less sensitive data exposure, clearer API contract, easier front-end integration, better performance, lower future maintenance risk. I suggested creating a focused response DTO for the screen. I also recommended keeping internal fields inside the service database layer instead of exposing them through the API. The teammate agreed, and we updated the response model together. Result: the API response became smaller and cleaner. The front-end integration became easier. The team used the same return-only required fields approach for later APIs. Why this answer works? This answer is good because it shows API design feedback, performance awareness, security awareness, front-end back-end alignment, constructive explanation, reusable team pattern. Example 5. Giving feedback to a junior developer situation. A junior developer was working on their first backend story in our project. Their code worked, but the structure did not follow our team pattern. Business logic was inside the controller, and there were no service layer tests. Task. I wanted to give feedback that helped them learn without making them feel discouraged. Action. I started by recognizing what they did well. I told them the feature logic was correct and that they had understood the requirement. Then I explained the project structure. I showed how our team usually separates a controller layer for request handling, service layer for business logic, repository layer for database access, DTOs for API contracts, exception handler for errors, tests for business rules. Instead of simply asking them to rewrite the code, I walked through an existing example in the codebase. Then I helped them move the business logic from the controller into the service layer. I also guided them in writing tests for the service logic. Result: the junior developer improved the implementation and learned the team pattern. Their next story followed the structure much more closely. The feedback helped them grow while still keeping the code quality high. Why this answer works? This answer is strong because it shows check mentoring, Check. Supportive feedback. Check. Teaching through examples. Check. Code quality improvement. Check. Patience. Helping teammate grow. Example 6. Giving feedback about logging situation. In one code review, I noticed that a teammate added several logs to help debug an issue. The logs were useful, but some messages included too much request information. There was a risk of logging sensitive data. Task. I needed to give feedback, so the logs remained useful but safer for production. Action. I explained that logging is important for troubleshooting, but we should avoid logging sensitive request payloads or internal details unnecessarily. I suggested improving the logs by including safe troubleshooting fields. For example, correlation ID, request ID, business identifier where safe, error code, operation name, status, timing information. I also suggested removing full payload logs and replacing them with structured, safe logs. I explained that this would still help debugging without exposing sensitive information. I also shared the team's logging standard and helped update the log statements. Result. The logs became safer and more consistent. Production troubleshooting remained possible using correlation IDs and error codes. The teammate understood the importance of secure logging and applied the pattern later. Why this answer works. This answer is good because it shows secure logging feedback, production awareness, sensitive data protection, constructive technical guidance, team standard alignment, security mindset. Example 7. Giving feedback about pull request size. In one sprint, a teammate created a very large pull request that included API changes, database changes, refactoring, and formatting updates. The code was difficult to review because unrelated changes were mixed together. Task. I needed to give feedback so future pull requests would be easier to review and safer to merge. Action. I first reviewed the pull request and identified which changes were required for the feature and which were unrelated cleanup. Then I gave feedback respectfully. I explained that the feature work was valuable, but the pull request was difficult to review because it contained too many types of changes. I suggested splitting future work into smaller pull requests. For example, 1 PR for database changes, 1 PR for API implementation, 1 PR for refactoring, 1 PR for formatting cleanup if needed. For the current PR, I helped identify low-risk cleanup changes that could be moved to a follow-up PR. I explained that smaller PRs reduce review time, reduce merge conflicts, and reduce deployment risk. Result. The current pull request became easier to review. The teammate started creating smaller PRs in future stories. Code review became faster and safer for the team. Why this answer works. This answer is strong because it shows closed, process improvement, code review efficiency, risk reduction, respectful feedback, team productivity, practical suggestion. Example 8. Giving feedback after a sprint retrospective. During a sprint retrospective, the team discussed that QA testing was often starting late because developers were not sharing enough information early. This caused last-minute questions and delayed story completion. Task. I wanted to give constructive feedback to the team and suggest a practical improvement. Action. I framed the feedback as a team process issue, not an individual problem. I said that developers could help QA earlier by sharing API details before the feature was fully complete. I suggested adding a checklist for backend stories. The checklist included COC, endpoint URL, request example, response example, validation rules, error response examples, authorization rules, test data, known edge cases. I explained that this would help QA prepare test cases earlier and reduce last-minute confusion. The team agreed to try this approach for the next sprint. Result. QA had better information earlier in the sprint. Testing became smoother. The team reduced back-and-forth questions near the end of the sprint. Why this answer works. This answer is good because it shows check, team-level feedback, retrospective participation, process improvement, QA collaboration, practical action item, Agile mindset. Best short answer version. If you need a short interview answer, you can say, in one sprint, I reviewed a teammate's pull request for a new Spring Boot REST API. The feature worked, but I noticed that the API returned a database entity directly, had duplicate validation logic, and had limited test coverage. I wanted to give feedback constructively, so I first acknowledged that the main functionality was working. Then I explained why the changes mattered. I mentioned that returning entities directly could expose internal fields and tightly couple the API to the database model. I suggested using a response DTO, moving common validation into a reusable method, and adding tests for edge cases. Instead of leaving many comments, I suggested a short call and shared an existing example from the codebase. I also offered to pair on the DTO mapping and test updates. As a result, the teammate updated the pull request, the API became cleaner and safer, and they used the same pattern in future stories. Common mistakes to avoid. 1. Sounding critical or harsh. Bad answer. I told them their code was bad. Better answer. I explained the risk and suggested a cleaner approach with examples. 2. Giving vague feedback. Bad answer. This needs improvement. Better answer. Returning entities directly can expose internal fields, so I suggested using a response DTO. 3. Giving feedback publicly when it should be private. Bad answer. I called it out in front of everyone. Better answer. For sensitive feedback, I spoke privately and focused on the work impact. 4. Not offering help. Bad answer. I told them to fix it. Better answer. I shared an example and offered to pair on the changes. 5. No result. Bad answer. They accepted my feedback. Better answer. The API became more maintainable, and the teammate reused the pattern in future work. Best practices for answering this question. Use the STAR method. Choose a professional feedback example. Start with what was working well. Be specific. Focus on behavior or code, not personality. Explain the reason behind the feedback. Offer examples or support. Keep the tone respectful. Show positive result. Mention what improved afterward. What interviewers are looking for. Interviewers want to see whether you can. Communicate feedback respectfully. Help teammates improve. Avoid blaming or embarrassing others. Give specific and useful suggestions. Support code quality. Mentor others. Improve team practices. Handle sensitive conversations maturely. For senior roles, they also want to see mentoring ability, code review leadership, technical judgment, team process improvement, emotional intelligence, ability to raise quality standards, constructive communication. Strong words to use in your answer. You can use words like acknowledged, explained, suggested, clarified, supported, reviewed, guided, shared examples, offered to pair, focused on impact, improved, aligned, encouraged. Example: I gave constructive feedback by first acknowledging what worked, then explaining the risk clearly, sharing an existing example, and offering to pair so the teammate could make the change confidently. Good constructive feedback topics you can use. Depending on your experience, you can talk about code review feedback, code improving test coverage, communication feedback, API design feedback, mentoring junior developer, secure logging feedback, pull request size feedback, retrospective team feedback, validation logic feedback, database query feedback, deployment notes feedback, documentation feedback, front-end, back-end, contract feedback, error handling feedback. Final summary. Tell me about a time you gave constructive feedback is an important interview question because software development requires collaboration, code review, and continuous improvement. The best answer should include: check. What situation required feedback? Why the feedback mattered? Your responsibility. How you gave the feedback respectfully. What examples or support you provided. How the teammate responded. Good examples include code review feedback, test coverage feedback, communication feedback, API design feedback, junior developer mentoring, logging feedback, pull request size feedback, retrospective feedback. The strongest answers show respect, clarity, technical judgment, mentoring, and positive team impact.